They came ashore expecting chaos. After weeks of bombardment, the Marines believed the volcanic beach would erupt with gunfire the moment their boots touched the sand. Instead, the landing craft opened onto an uncanny quiet. The surf hissed against the black shore, but no rifles cracked. No machine guns probed their approach. It was the kind of silence that did not reassure. It warned. Only when they moved inland did the truth reveal itself. Carved into the island's jagged cliffs lay a labyrinth of reinforced caves, galleries, and hidden firing chambers. The Japanese garrison had vanished beneath the earth, preparing to fight not for position, but for annihilation. Every tunnel was angled to protect the defenders from naval shells. Every chamber was connected to 3 others. The Marines were not advancing toward enemies. They were advancing into a system. The first squads that tried to climb the terraces were met by invisible fire. Bullets slipped out of narrow embrasures, cut so precisely that no muzzle flash escaped. Men dropped without seeing who had struck them. The island itself seemed to be shooting. Officers halted the movement, aware that pushing forward blind would only feed more lives into the same geometry of death. Reports from earlier Pacific battles drifted back through the ranks. Tarawa, Peleliu, Saipan, each one marked by fortified caves, interlocking fields of fire, and defenders who treated surrender as a kind of moral failure. This island followed the same pattern, only refined to its cruelest form. The Marines understood that brute force alone would not tear it open. Along the beach, commanders spoke quietly, their voices flattened by wind and ash. Offshore waited an armored vehicle few had seen outside training grounds, a machine still untested in conditions like these. Whether it would matter, whether anything could matter against the island's hidden system, was a question no one dared answer aloud. For now, heat shimmered upward from the volcanic sand, carrying with it the sense of an approaching struggle unlike any the Pacific had yet revealed. And out beyond the gray horizon, the vessel carrying that unproven weapon drifted closer, unaware of the role it was about to play. For 3 days, the island shook beneath the weight of American fire. Naval guns raked the cliffs with shells larger than truck engines, and bombers stitched the ridgelines with explosives intended to turn fortifications into dust. Yet when the smoke drifted away, the same dark openings remained. The bombardment had rearranged the shoreline, but it had not broken it. To the Marines watching from the beach, it felt as though they were firing at a mountain that refused to acknowledge their presence. They began calling the bunkers Iron Mountains, not because they were made of metal, but because the volcanic rock, mixed with concrete and reinforced by nature itself, behaved like armor plate. Shells struck with full force and left only shallow fractures, as if the earth absorbed the violence and returned nothing. The name spread through the battalions, half description, half admission. Flamethrower teams attempted the impossible. To reach a firing slit meant crawling across exposed ground, each foot gained under the scrutiny of unseen gunners. The moment the torches hissed to life, the slits answered. Men were cut down before they could lift their nozzles, the fuel tanks on their backs turning them into slow-moving targets. The approach paths became graveyards of broken equipment, and of those who had believed fire might succeed where steel had failed. Command logs recorded the same conclusion again and again. Only flame forced the defenders to withdraw, yet flame could not be brought close enough. Inside the tunnels, Japanese soldiers endured the tremors of bombardment with a grim steadiness. American firepower was overwhelming, but survivable if one remained underground. They understood that every day the Marines failed to breach the cliffs was a day purchased in blood. A stalemate settled over the island. If the Americans moved, they died. If they held their ground, the initiative slipped away. Neither side gained, Both sides bled. In that stillness, whispers began to circulate. Rumors of a weapon designed for these very walls. A machine capable of reaching into places no infantryman could approach. And far offshore, beneath canvas coverings and salted air, that machine waited for its first summons. It appeared through the morning haze like a creature rising from the sea. As the tide receded, a squat silhouette rolled up from the surf, an M4 Sherman, but altered, its turret crowned with a long tubular projection that caught the first light like a piece of metal bone. Marines paused to stare, unsure whether they were looking at an innovation or an omen. The crews had already given it a name. They called it the Ronson, a reference whispered with a kind of grim humor. The nickname came from a lighter famed for one trait. It lit the first time, every time. In war, such reliability carried both promise and threat. The tank's flame projector could send fire farther, hotter, and more predictably than any man who carried a fuel pack on his back. When the first test burst arced across the sand, the Marines stepped back instinctively. A jet of flame stretched beyond anything they had seen, curling against the volcanic rock as though searching for breath. The heat washed over the spectators, a reminder that this was not just another tool. It was a force that rewrote the terms of confrontation. For the first time, the defenders' hidden walls seemed reachable. Nearby, engineers explained the details with the calm precision of men who had assembled the system, bolt by bolt. Pressurized fuel tanks fed a stream through armored conduits. An ignition mechanism mounted at the projector's tip turned liquid into fire with a single spark. The Sherman's armor protected the crew from small arms fire, allowing them to move closer than any flamethrower operator could hope to survive. It was engineering repurposed into inevitability. Across the ridge, Japanese observers marked the tank's arrival, but saw only the outline of a standard Sherman. They noted its movement, its position, its angle of approach, unaware that the long snout was not a cannon but a device built to reach into their tunnels. Misinterpretation, in war, often cost more than ignorance. One young private, watching the machine idle on the beach, murmured that it looked angry. Not menacing, not proud, simply angry, as if the metal itself carried purpose. By sundown, commanders would finalize the assault plan, and the Ronson would be written into the first wave, its true test only hours away. To the officers of the island garrison, the strength of their defenses was not a matter of hope, but of doctrine. Months before the first American shell touched the shore, engineers had carved a world beneath the volcanic crust, rooms reinforced with basalt, tunnels aligned to deflect concussion, chambers sealed by stone thicker than any battleship's armor. Japanese High Command believed these spaces to be impregnable. The mountain, they argued, was the true defender. Their task was merely to endure within it. Official doctrine taught that flame, for all its terror, was fleeting. Fire needed air, and deep underground the air was rationed, the walls dense enough to choke heat before it spread. The officers had studied earlier campaigns, where American flamethrowers roared at tunnel mouths, yet failed to reach the men hidden yards inside. Those memories hardened into certainty. Flame could frighten, but not penetrate. In the volcanic heart of this island, fear itself would burn out first. Garrison leaders repeated this conviction with the cadence of instruction. During evening assemblies, they reminded their men that the Americans relied on machinery and spectacle, while Japan relied on patience. If the defenders held their ground, if they absorbed the assault as stone absorbs waves, then steel would break, not flesh. "Endurance will beat steel," one colonel declared, his voice echoing off the walls of a tunnel, carved by hand and stubbornness. The men nodded, not because the phrase inspired them, but because repetition made it feel inevitable. Pinned to the walls of command posts were the blueprints of the island's defense, fan-shaped kill zones overlapping like the petals of a lethal flower. Every corridor led to a trap. Every opening offered a field of fire. Tanks were expected to advance into these channels, bog down in the ash, and be dismantled by anti-tank guns hidden behind deceptive embrasures. The planners believed the geometry alone could defeat armored assault. Their confidence lay not in technological parity, but in the careful mathematics of defense. Among the soldiers, a mantra circulated, half reassurance, half challenge. The American cannot burn the mountain. They repeated it while cleaning rifles, while waiting in silence for the next bombardment, while breathing the stale air that had to last through months of siege. The phrase reduced the enemy's power to a physical impossibility, as if nature itself had taken their side. In these tunnels, men found comfort not in command, but in geology. Yet beneath the confidence lay a quiet oversight. Their memories of American flamethrowers came from infantry weapons, whose reach could be measured in yards, whose pressure waned after seconds. None of them had imagined a device that could hurl a column of flame with the force of artillery, driven not by muscle but by machinery. They had prepared for heat, but not for pressure. Pressure strong enough to wrap around corners, penetrate vents, and turn oxygen against them. In the dim glow of their lamps, the defenders believed the fortress would hold. But beyond the shoreline, hidden beneath a canvas tarp, the machine that would challenge that belief was warming its engine for the first time. In the months leading to the landings, American commanders had already accepted a painful truth. Infantry alone could not break the Pacific's fortified islands. Tarawa had shown them how a single bunker could stall an entire battalion. Saipan had revealed the cost of advancing across open ground while defenders waited in interlocked caves. In each battle, flamethrower tanks, few in number, crude in design, had tipped the balance when nothing else could. By the time planning began for this volcanic stronghold, U.S. Army and Marine leadership no longer saw flame armor as an experiment. They saw it as necessity. Training films circulated through stateside bases, grainy reels that depicted plywood bunkers collapsing into fire within seconds. The footage showed flame projectors sweeping across mock embrasures with unnerving efficiency, turning obstacles that once required hours of fighting into problems solved in moments. The message was clear. Where rifles stalled, where artillery failed, fire could complete the work quickly, decisively, and with fewer casualties. The films did not show the human cost. They were not meant to. Engineers, standing beside charts and cutaway diagrams, explained how a Sherman fitted with thick frontal armor could do what a man could not. A flamethrower operator, advancing on foot, could be killed long before reaching a firing slit. But a tank, its steel face angled against ricochets, could drive straight toward the embrasure and hold position. In front of that narrow opening, sometimes no wider than a handspan, the tank could deliver flame into the heart of the defense, ignoring machine gun fire that would have shredded any exposed crewman. Armor, pressure, and proximity formed the new equation of assault. Inside those armored hulls, the crews were schooled in an unusual form of discipline. Flamethrower tanks did not fire like guns. They required rhythm, not recoil. Every operator learned to pulse short bursts, to conserve precious fuel for the moments that mattered. They were warned against sweeping too wide or too long, lest they exhaust their supply before reaching the true threat. Instructors repeated the same phrase, "Calm hands win the fight." It was a reminder that flame, despite its fury, demanded precision. Infantry units adjusted their tactics accordingly. Instead of forming long assault lines anchored by rifle teams, They began shaping their plans around the path of the flame tank. Platoons were assigned to protect its flanks, engineers to clear its routes, machine gunners to suppress enemy openings while it advanced. The tank became the pivot of the attack, the one weapon capable of turning a labyrinth of stone into something vulnerable. For the first time, infantry saw a way to approach a fortress without being consumed by it. A quiet belief began to spread through the ranks that this machine, this melding of armor and fire, might shorten the war. It was not spoken openly, superstition and caution forbade that, but many felt it nonetheless. If the tank could pry open the hardest islands, then each victory might spare 1,000 men the climb toward Tokyo. Yet among the crews themselves, the optimism carried weight. They knew better than anyone what their weapon did to those in its path. They understood that every burst was a sentence, and every mission forced them to confront the line between strategy and destruction. Responsibility settled over them like heat in a closed turret, inescapable, undeniable. By dawn, that responsibility would move from theory to reality as the flame tanks rolled toward the first of the Iron Mountains waiting in the volcanic dark. Night settled over the volcanic plain with a heaviness that felt almost deliberate, as though the island itself wished to hide the preparations unfolding upon it. In a shallow depression behind the forward line, the flamethrower tanks stood in silence, their engines cooling, their steel darkened by ash. Marines moved among them with practiced efficiency, refilling fuel reservoirs and checking ignition systems beneath the dim red glow of shielded lamps. The work was quiet, but not calm. Every man knew that the hours before dawn would be the last moments of stillness they would feel for days. Across the ridge, unseen but not absent, Japanese defenders made their own preparations. Officers walked the narrow tunnels, reviewing plans for counterattacks designed to isolate and destroy any American armor that broke through the initial defenses. Grenade teams rehearsed moves in the dim light. Gunners calculated the distances to choke points where they expected tanks to falter. Inside the stone network, the atmosphere was taut yet orderly, men committing to the roles assigned to them, unaware of the true nature of the weapons gathering outside. Both sides believed they understood the shape of the coming battle. To the Americans, it would be another attempt to pry open the volcanic cliffs, this time with flame armor leading the way. To the Japanese, it would be a test of their tunnels and their training, a chance to demonstrate that even American tanks could bleed against stone. Each force saw the confrontation through its own framework, each certain that the next day would confirm what they already believed about fire, armor, and endurance. In one of the Shermans, a tank commander leaned over the pressure gauge mounted beside the projector feed line. The needle rested exactly where it should, neither too low, which would send flames sputtering uselessly against stone, nor too high, which could rupture a line under stress. That single dial held the lives of his crew more surely than any armor plate. If the pressure failed, they would be trapped in front of a firing slit with no weapon left but hope. He checked it twice, then a third time, his breath leaving a faint cloud against the steel. From the opposite side of the battlefield, Japanese spotters watched the faint silhouettes of tanks massing near the American perimeter. In the weak moonlight, the vehicles looked like standard Shermans forming up for a push toward the terraces. The spotters reported the gathering armor to their superiors, who prepared their gun crews accordingly. None noted the elongated projectors mounted on some of the turrets, or the canvas-wrapped equipment that marked the machines as something else entirely. Misinterpretation, once again, became part of the terrain. Officers on both sides felt the weight of the coming hours. American commanders spoke in short, measured tones, reminding their men that the tanks must break the initial line or the entire day's advance would collapse. Japanese officers, walking the tunnels one final time, instructed their soldiers to hold, to absorb the assault, to wait for the moment when the attackers stretched themselves too far. Both groups believed they were preparing for a decisive day shaped by familiar patterns, but dawn has a way of rewriting certainty. As the first thin line of gray approached the eastern horizon, each army held fast to convictions that had carried them through earlier battles. Neither understood that the weapon waiting at the front, quiet now, but coiled with pressure, would soon break the assumptions that anchored both sides. And when the sun finally rose over the black sand, the siege would not unfold as either army had imagined. The first light of morning revealed a shoreline still shrouded in drifting smoke. Out of that haze came the shape that the infantry had been waiting for, the flamethrower Sherman, moving at a deliberate crawl toward the nearest bunker. Its treads pressed deep into the black sand, each rotation sending a muted vibration through the ground. Small arms fire cracked from the cliffs immediately, but the rounds sparked harmlessly against its armor, scattering bright flecks of metal that faded before they touched the earth. The tank pressed on, unhurried, as if the bullets themselves were beneath its notice. Behind the armored mass, a squad of Marines kept low, their advance dictated not by their own pace, but by the slow, steady rhythm of the vehicle ahead. They felt the tremor of its engine through their boots, a low, continuous pulse that grounded them even as enemy fire reached out from the darkness. To follow behind the hull was to stand in the one safe place on that exposed approach. To step outside its shadow was to invite an immediate reckoning. Inside the bunker, Japanese gunners watched the tank approach through a narrow embrasure, barely wider than a rifle barrel. They fired with the precision born of discipline, short, controlled bursts meant to strike the vision slits or the fuel lines they believed lay exposed. But their rounds struck the thick face of the Sherman and flattened on impact, leaving only dark smears on the steel. The crews had trained for this moment, to hold position, to keep firing, to believe that stone and geometry could halt a machine advancing without hesitation. Closer and closer the tank moved, its hull now so near the embrasure that the gunners inside could feel the vibration through the rock. The distance, once measured in yards, shrank to feet. At that proximity, infantry weapons were useless. The defenders shifted to grenades, trying to angle them through the slit, but the narrow opening denied them. The stone walls that had protected them so well now funneled their world into a space too tight to fight back. Inside the turret, the commander studied the view through the periscope. His voice remained steady, shaped by training and the knowledge that hesitation at this range could cost the crew their lives. He gave the word that the men had practiced but never spoken in combat. Ignition. The flame projector answered with a low mechanical cough, followed by a roar that drowned the morning air. A column of fire leapt from the tank's snout with a force unlike anything carried by a man. It bridged the distance to the embrasure instantly, striking the opening with a violent brightness that swallowed the shadows inside. The flame did not stop at the surface. Pressurized fuel surged forward, curling through the slit, bending around interior angles, reaching into chambers the crew could not see. Inside the bunker, the reaction was immediate. The roar of the flamethrower echoed through the tunnels like an approaching storm, followed by a sudden collapse of sound. Shouts cut off mid-breath, machinery falling silent, the sharp ring of metal dropped on stone. Within seconds, a position that had resisted days of bombardment grew quiet. The silence that followed was not the calm of discipline, but the stillness of a fight already decided. Outside, the Marines watched the flame retract back into the projector, leaving behind a plume of dark smoke drifting slowly from the embrasure. The tank held position for a moment longer, its engine idling as the commander confirmed the bunker's silence. Then, with the same steady cadence, it began to pivot toward the next target. For the infantry, the realization came not as a shout, but as a dawning certainty. The weapon they had followed across the sand was not simply another tool. It was a change in the terms of war itself. The mountain could bleed. The tunnels could be reached. The defenses that had held for weeks could be unmade in seconds. And as word spread down the line, one thought moved among the Marines with the clarity of sunrise. The battlefield had just changed forever. But deeper within the ridge, untouched tunnels waited, defenders unprepared, unaware that the fire now moving toward them obeyed no rule they had ever studied. With the first bunkers breached, the engineers stepped forward, not to celebrate, but to observe. Every burst of flame, every angle of approach, every plume of smoke rising from an embrasure became a lesson. They watched the fuel stream as it struck stone, watched how heat ricocheted through tight apertures, watched how long it took for silence to return after each ignition. Then, with clipboards and grease pencils, they began refining the art of armored fire. Short pulses, not long streams, preserved precious fuel. A slight rotation of the turret could angle flame into side ports invisible from the front. Forward momentum mattered. Hesitation allowed defenders to recover. The tank was powerful, but only when wielded with discipline. Infantry absorbed these lessons just as quickly. The moment a blast lit the interior of a bunker, troops surged from behind the tank's hull, entering positions that seconds earlier had been unapproachable. They moved through scorched chambers with rifles raised, clearing pockets of resistance before defenders could regroup deeper inside. The coordination became instinctive. Flame, advance, secure. In the volcanic dust, the choreography felt almost mechanical, but each movement carried the weight of survival. The tanks opened the door. The infantry ensured it stayed open. As the rhythm solidified, bunkers once marked as untouchable began to fall in sequence. Positions that artillery had chipped at for days collapsed within minutes. The sight of a fresh bunker, once a source of dread, became a practical problem rather than a looming threat. The combination of armor and fire turned terrain into something malleable. What had been a fortress became a series of solvable equations. Yet the defenders did not stand still. Japanese units reacted with the ingenuity of men fighting from the edge of possibility. They hauled sand and volcanic ash to choke off vents, stacked barrels of water behind embrasures, and prepared countercharges meant to detonate beside an advancing tank. They experimented with dampened cloth, angled shutters, and improvised barriers placed just inside tunnel mouths. Each measure was intended to disrupt the flame's path, to starve it of oxygen or break its pressure before it reached the living chambers. But none of it held for long. Pressurized fuel from the tank was not a gentle flame. It was force. When it struck an opening, the pressure pushed past the first barrier and the second. Water barrels toppled and burst. Sand melted into glassy patches along the tunnel floor. Shutters tore from their hinges. And deeper within the tunnels, the overpressure, an invisible wave created by the blast, pushed flame around corners, down shafts, and through cracks that defenders had never considered vulnerable. The fire behaved less like a weapon and more like an expanding atmosphere. Even so, the weapon was not flawless. Tank crews found themselves wrestling with new technical problems after every engagement. The nozzles clogged with burnt residue from volcanic dust and scorched debris. Pumps overheated under the strain of sustained pressure, forcing crews to halt and let the system cool while bullets spattered harmlessly against the armor. Some tanks lost ignition after repeated blasts, requiring dangerous field repairs only yards from the enemy. A misjudged angle could cause fuel to pool along the tank's own hull. momentarily turning the machine into a lantern visible from every ridge. Adaptation became the currency of survival. Engineers adjusted fuel mixtures to maintain pressure under heat. Crews learned to clear clogged nozzles in seconds, not minutes. Infantry refined their timing, waiting for the exact moment a bunker fell silent before advancing, never earlier, never later. On the opposite side, defenders treated each disaster as a new data point, adjusting tunnels, shifting gun positions, developing signals to warn when a flame tank approached. In this back and forth, the battle evolved into something neither side had expected, a contest defined not only by fire and stone, but by the mind's ability to adjust faster than catastrophe could arrive. And as the lines shifted and the volcano's face changed day by day, a darker innovation waited in the shadows, one that neither engineers nor soldiers had yet confronted. Word moved through the tunnels faster than runners could carry it. At first, it was only a rumor, an overheard fragment passed from one chamber to the next, that the Americans possessed a machine capable of sending fire farther than any grenade, farther than a man could throw, farther even than the tunnels were deep. Defenders who had not yet seen the weapon dismissed the idea as another exaggeration born from stress, but those stationed near the front understood the truth. They had heard the roar. They had felt the heat drift through cracks that had never been warm before. As more bunkers collapsed in moments rather than hours, morale inside the mountain began to tilt. Positions that officers had promised were invincible fell with alarming speed. The stone walls, carved with such confidence, had become conduits for a weapon no one had imagined. Veterans of earlier island battles whispered that the Americans had found a way to bend fire itself, forcing it around bends, through vents, and into rooms untouched by shrapnel. Each new collapse deepened the sense that the mountain was no longer an ally, but an opening waiting to be pried apart. Yet on the American side, victory did not feel clean. Marines advancing through the aftermath could not ignore the weight of what they witnessed. The fire left no symmetry, no familiar pattern of destruction. It moved unpredictably, leaving pockets of untouched stone beside chambers stripped of oxygen and sound. Men spoke quietly after each assault, aware that the weapon protecting them also reshaped their understanding of war. They moved because they had to, not because they wished to see what fire had done. Sensing the moral strain, commanders reminded their troops that discipline defined the weapon as much as machinery. Orders were explicit. Flame would be used only against confirmed hostile positions, never in blind retaliation, never out of fear. The weapon's reach demanded restraint. Every burst was deliberate, measured, recorded. In this way, the Americans hoped to maintain not only control, but a semblance of humanity within the harsh logic of tunnel warfare. Survivors on the Japanese side offered accounts that sounded almost elemental. They described heat waves coursing through the tunnels like storms, silent one moment, then rushing forward with a force that stole breath before flame ever touched stone. Some felt the air change pressure, collapsing lungs for a heartbeat before the fire arrived. Others spoke of walls shimmering, as if the mountain were exhaling. These descriptions spread among the troops, blending fact with memory, but all carried the same lesson. The enemy had found a way to make distance meaningless. As the psychological weight deepened, some Japanese detachments chose to meet the weapon on their own terms. Rather than wait inside a chamber that might become a furnace, they organized last charges, small groups rushing into the open to engage American lines before the tanks drew near. These attacks were rarely effective, but they were purposeful. To die in motion felt different than dying in place. To some, it felt like reclaiming dignity from a weapon that denied them the chance to fight back. Yet even these charges reflected the larger truth shaping the battlefield. The struggle had become more than a contest of ground and firepower. It was a conflict between belief systems, one side trusting in machines refined by engineering, the other in a world shaped by endurance, honor, and stone. The flame tank did more than destroy bunkers. It eroded a world view. It proved that fire, once a fleeting threat, could be shaped into something persistent and exact. Technology had begun to outpace conviction. And in that widening gap, the defenders felt a quiet unraveling, while the attackers carried the burden of a weapon as transformative as it was terrible. But deeper still, untouched galleries waited in the mountain's far chambers, spaces where neither side yet understood how the next stage of the siege would unfold. By late morning, the flame tanks were no longer moving as isolated instruments, but as a coordinated line of advancing pressure. Engineers had mapped the volcanic ridge and identified the nodes where Japanese defenses interlocked, chambers that fed fire and ammunition to the surrounding bunkers, galleries whose collapse would unspool entire segments of the network. Now, for the first time, multiple flamethrower Shermans advanced in unison, each assigned a precise angle of attack. Their engines growled across the ash, slow but unstoppable, like a series of pistons driving a single machine. From inside the mountain, Japanese officers tried desperately to impose order. They issued commands through runners, but the tunnels, once so meticulously organized, had begun to fracture under the strain of days of bombardment. Where a corridor had once linked 3 firing positions, a cave-in now choked the path with rock and dust. Telephone lines, already fragile, snapped under concussions in the upper galleries. Officers raised their voices in the dark, but their words traveled only as far as the nearest bend. Beyond that point, confusion reigned. To the defenders at the front, the coordinated assault felt different from anything that had come before. Instead of confronting a single flame tank that could be tracked and countered, the Japanese gunners watched multiple streams of fire bloom across the ridgeline like sudden, violent banners. Bunkers long accustomed to supporting one another now found themselves isolated, unable to warn their neighbors, unable to shift fire toward a single shared threat. Each tank took its target and held its ground, delivering short, measured pulses that carved through the stone's defenses. Then came the breach. It occurred at a place the Japanese had believed unassailable, a junction where 3 tunnels met beneath a reinforced bunker. The position had withstood days of shelling and 2 separate infantry assaults. Yet when a single flamethrower tank reached its embrasure, a trip that took only minutes, the entire chamber unraveled. A burst of flame entered the first port, pushing deep into a cavity that connected to 2 more. The overpressure surged through the chamber like a physical blow, collapsing wooden braces, scattering sandbags, and overwhelming the men inside before they could retreat to the next level. The collapse echoed down the tunnels like a drumbeat. When the smoke cleared enough for reconnaissance, the Marines realized what the blast had created: a gap. It was small, only a handful of yards wide, but it cut directly into the web of interlocked positions. For months, the defenders had held the surface while controlling the underground approaches. Now, for the first time, the Americans could move into the space between the tunnels and the ridgeline. Infantry surged forward, driven by instinct and opportunity. They advanced behind a curtain of suppressive fire, crossing terrain that had always been forbidden. There was no time to celebrate. They simply ran, into the opening, past shattered embrasures, past the broken mouth of the strongpoint that had anchored the Japanese front. Behind them, tanks pivoted, aligning their projectors toward the next openings in the cliff. Inside the mountain, the defenders understood what had happened before they ever saw the breach. They felt the shift in airflow, heard the sudden echo of rifles in corridors that should have been distant. Attempts to reposition were met with an unexpected geometry of flame. As Japanese teams rushed from one chamber to another, they found themselves caught in intersecting arcs. Streams of fire projected from different angles, sealing off pathways they had once used without thought. The tunnels that had promised freedom of movement became trap lines. The fall of the key bunker, the one deemed untakeable, spread panic through the underground positions. Runners emerged into dead ends where once there had been junctions. Gun crews relocated to fallback chambers only to find them already compromised by collapse. Orders dissolved into fragments, and fragments into silence. Courage remained, but the structure that had supported it was gone. What made the moment decisive was not the destruction of a single position, but the unraveling of the system itself. Each bunker had relied on another, each chamber had fed the next. Now that web had torn, and the entire fortress began to fail from the inside outward. Fire forced the defenders back, then down, then deeper still, until the logic of the mountain no longer held. For the Americans, the collapse marked a turning point, not measured in yards, but in understanding. The fortress had been built to survive steel and blast, but it had never been designed for pressure. Relentless, focused, and unyielding. And as the Marines pushed into the broken corridors, they realized that the next battle would not be won by flame alone, but by meeting whatever waited deeper in the mountain's fading dark. As the outer defenses fell, the surviving Japanese troops withdrew into the deepest chambers of the volcanic maze. These were spaces carved not for comfort, but for endurance. Low ceilings, narrow passages, and walls that seemed to compress the very air. Here, in the innermost dark, officers gathered what remained of their units and prepared for the kind of fighting that accepted no return. They knew the mountain had begun to fail above them, yet still they believed that the inner tunnels, if held long enough, might bleed the Americans dry. For the advancing U.S. forces, the victory outside the ridgeline brought no sense of ease. The tunnels were a different world altogether, a place where visibility shrank to arm's length, where echoes distorted direction, and where every bend concealed a choice between restraint and sudden violence. Marines entered the first chambers cautiously, weapons raised, trying to separate civilians pressed into service from armed defenders, trying to read shadows that offered no clues. It was a terrain where courage demanded more than aggression. It demanded judgment. The flame tanks moved as close as the terrain allowed, their treads grinding against uneven ground as they approached the mouths of the deeper tunnel systems. Here, distance lost meaning. The crews fired at impossibly close ranges, measured in feet, not yards, each burst calibrated with a care that belied the terror inside the turret. Too much flame risked collapsing the tunnel and sealing American troops inside. Too little left defenders capable of counterattack. Every ignition felt like holding a breath over a cliff edge. Inside the tunnels, Japanese soldiers prepared their final resort. Banzai charges had always been costly, but in these narrow confines, they became a weapon of last conviction. Small groups sprinted through the blackness toward the tank silhouettes, hoping to throw explosives against the hull or wedge grenades beneath the tracks. The air filled with sudden footsteps, brief shouts, and the sharp concussion of close-range detonations. Most of the charges failed. The approach routes were too exposed, the American perimeter too tight, but each one carried the weight of men choosing action over immolation. One charge found its mark. A single tank, attempting to pivot near a tunnel mouth, was struck by explosives placed against its rear armor. The blast rocked the turret and severed the ignition line, leaving the machine silent in the zone where it was needed most. Smoke seeped through the ventilation plates, and the crew bailed out under covering fire from nearby Marines. The loss of the tank was not strategic. The Americans had others, but its stillness on the black sand was a reminder that even the most decisive weapons carried limits, and that the defenders, cornered though they were, could still find the narrow openings where sacrifice became lethality. Despite the setback, the American advance pressed into the deeper galleries. Engineers brought demolition charges to widen passages too tight for infantry movement. Riflemen cleared chambers one by one, using measured bursts to suppress fragments of resistance rather than drown them in excessive fire. Each room felt like a self-contained world, hot, airless, echoing with the memory of what had passed through moments earlier. The deeper they went, the more the defenders relied on desperation rather than plan, and the more the Americans relied on restraint rather than force. The final redoubts resisted with a ferocity born from belief. Machine gun teams fired until barrels glowed. Grenadiers hurled explosives through smoke thick enough to make the tunnels feel like burning furnaces even without flame. Officers issued orders almost by instinct, their voices steadied by the knowledge that holding these last spaces was their final obligation. But stone, once overmatched by pressure and heat, offered no further refuge. Demolition charges placed with precision cracked the inner walls. Concentrated fire surged through openings too narrow to shield the men behind them. One chamber fell, then another, and another. By the end of the day, resistance no longer came in coordinated bursts. It came in scattered echoes, isolated shots from rooms soon to be taken, stray shouts from chambers soon to be sealed. The fortress, once a living system of defense, had lost its rhythm. It no longer fought with unity. It only endured in pieces, each fragment collapsing under the weight of the same inevitability. The turning point was complete. The bastion that had defied bombardment, repelled infantry, and resisted the mathematics of siege had reached the end of its design. It had not surrendered. It had simply run out of space, out of breath, out of belief. And beyond the final chambers, where the tunnels thinned into silence, the battle prepared to shift once more, from the dying fortress to the question of what its fall would mean for the war beyond it. When the final echoes faded from the tunnels and the last pockets of resistance dissolved into silence, commanders issued the words that had taken weeks of unrelenting combat to earn. The island was secure. The declaration did not bring celebration. It arrived instead like an exhale after a long-held breath, a recognition that the struggle had ended, not with a single moment of triumph, but with a slow, grinding attrition that consumed everything in its path. For the Marines who had endured the ordeal, victory felt less like a flag raised and more like a weight lowered, briefly, cautiously. In the days that followed, the men walked the ground they had fought upon and saw how profoundly the battle had remade it. The volcanic surface, once a series of slopes and terraces, had become a blasted landscape of collapsed bunkers, charred embrasures, and trenches filled with hardened ash. The earth bore the imprint of flame. Walls fused into glassy sheets, vents blackened by smoke, tunnels widened by demolition charges. What had once been a fortress carved by human hands had turned into a wasteland shaped by fire and steel. Engineers began their assessments almost immediately. They catalogued every engagement, tallying gallons of fuel expended, distances covered, nozzles replaced, pumps overheated and repaired in the field. The numbers told their own story. Without the flamethrower Shermans, the assault would have cost far more lives and taken far more time. Shells alone could not penetrate the tunnels. Infantry alone could not reach the embrasures. But pressure, directed with precision, had done what neither explosive nor manpower could achieve. The reports circulated upward through the chain of command, and soon after, The conclusion was unanimous. The tanks had been decisive. For the survivors, the statistics carried a different weight. Casualty counts were read aloud beside supply tallies, and the contrast was stark. The victory had not come cheaply. Marines who had cleared tunnels now helped recover the wounded and the dead, carrying stretchers through the same chambers where their boots had slipped on volcanic dust days earlier. The defenders suffered even greater losses, numbers that defied easy comprehension, numbers that reflected not only defeat, but the total commitment with which the garrison had fought. The battlefield held no illusions about the price paid on either side. Letters written home in the aftermath echoed this duality. Some described the achievement with restrained pride, acknowledging that the operation had broken one of the toughest islands in the Pacific. But many letters spoke of something more complex, a quiet sorrow for what the war required, a sense of unease at the power the flame tanks wielded, and a recognition that victory did not erase the memory of what had been seen beneath the mountain's surface. The men did not share details easily, even among themselves. Some memories were too hot to touch. Months later, when Allied intelligence examined captured Japanese records, the documents revealed a perspective that few Americans had imagined. Reports from the garrison described the flamethrower tank not as a weapon, but as a phenomenon, something that defied prior doctrine. Officers wrote of pressure waves moving through tunnels before flame appeared, of heat that seemed to travel around corners, of defenses engineered to stop artillery failing under a force they had no name for. The shock was not simply tactical, it was spiritual. The fortress had been built on a belief, and that belief had met a machine it could not outlast. When the war moved beyond the island, the battle faded from public attention. Larger operations awaited. New strategies formed. Another shoreline, another objective. Another stretch of ocean called for the same men who had survived the volcanic ash. But for those who had fought there, the memory of bunker warfare lingered with a permanence that outlasted reports and commendations. It lived in the smell of scorched stone, in the quiet moments when the ground no longer trembled, in the knowledge that victory had come through a weapon whose power none of them had imagined on the day they first stepped ashore. And as the campaign advanced across the Pacific, the lessons carved into that island, harsh, undeniable, unforgettable, traveled with them into the battles still ahead. In the weeks following the battle, the first after-action reports began arriving at fleet headquarters. They contained the usual tables, casualty figures, ammunition expenditures, estimates of remaining enemy strength. But tucked within the pages was something new, a recommendation repeated so consistently that it read less like opinion and more like inevitability. Flamethrower tanks, the officers wrote, were no longer optional assets. They were essential tools for every major island assault still ahead. The commanders who had watched the volcanic fortress collapse understood that this weapon had not merely contributed to victory, it had redefined what victory required. Industrial planners studied these reports with the sobriety of men aware that future operations depended on their speed. Factories that once produced standard Shermans began setting aside space for conversion lines. Flamethrower kits, pressurized tanks, armored conduits, ignition assemblies were placed into accelerated production schedules. Engineers refined components that had failed under battlefield stress, hardening valves, and improving pump cooling systems to ensure the next generation of vehicles could survive longer engagements. The weapon that had once been considered experimental now moved quietly into the realm of mass manufacture. Across the Pacific, Japanese high command came to its own reckoning. Intercepted dispatches and later battlefield documents revealed a tone of recognition bordering on resignation. Traditional tunnel defenses, vast networks that had once stymied infantry, resisted artillery, and consumed weeks of combat, could not withstand a mechanism that projected flame with compressed force. Analysts examined blueprints, studied surviving fortifications, and searched for ways to counter the new threat. Suggestions emerged: deeper tunnels, wider vents, improved ventilation, but none addressed the weapon's ability to push fire around corners and through narrow openings. For the first time, the architects of island defense saw limits in their strategy that mere endurance could not overcome. The broader reality settled in with quiet finality. Fixed fortifications, no matter how intricate or concealed, could not stop mechanized fire. The very foundation of Japanese defensive doctrine, outlasting bombardment, resisting penetration, channeling attackers into kill zones, was undermined by a machine that ignored the logic of the battlefield and rewrote the map with pressure and heat. Stone could outlast shells. It could not outlast flame that traveled as if it had intent. Allied strategists absorbed this lesson with measured clarity. Planning committees for future invasions, Okinawa, the Philippines, and operations projected even beyond, began integrating flame armor into the opening phases of assault. Landings were redesigned so tanks could reach fortified points earlier. Engineer battalions were tasked with clearing paths specifically to enable armored flame units to move inland. Even naval bombardment schedules shifted, timed now to create openings the tanks could exploit. The weapon was no longer simply support. It was the lodestone around which entire operations were oriented. With these changes came a transformation in the infantry's role. Assault manuals that had guided Pacific warfare since Guadalcanal were rewritten with new priorities. Instead of leading charges against entrenched defenses, rifle units were now trained to protect the tanks, clearing ambush positions, securing flanks, and preparing captured tunnels for demolition. Instructors emphasized coordination, timing, and restraint. The flamethrower tank would strike the position. The infantry would secure the ground. The engineers would neutralize whatever remained. Warfare had become a sequence rather than a collision. Through all of this, a quiet truth emerged, one not stated outright in reports, but felt in every revised plan and every new assembly line. Technology had become the unseen architect of strategy. The flamethrower tank had not won the battle alone, but it had dictated its shape. It had forced adaptation, compelled rethinking, and introduced a new rhythm to an old struggle. In its wake, neither side could rely on the assumptions that had defined the early years of the Pacific War, and as the conflict pressed toward its final shores, that silent author, the machine born of necessity, would continue to write the chapters still to come. When the campaign moved on, and the uniforms were folded into footlockers, the men who had fought among the volcanic tunnels carried with them memories that did not fade with distance. For many veterans, the flame tank became a symbol not of triumph, but of complexity, an invention that had protected them, yet asked them to witness what no training manual had prepared them to endure. Some remembered the way the ground shuddered beneath each burst. Others recalled the silence that followed, a silence so complete it felt unnatural. In later years, when asked what they saw, many paused before answering. Some never answered at all. Across the ocean, Japanese survivors carried their own recollections, memories shaped not by what the fire destroyed, but by the terror of what it became inside the stone. They spoke of heat that moved faster than footsteps, of chambers filling with the sound of rushing air, of the sudden brightness that erased shadows before they could step away from them. For those who lived through the siege, the flame was not merely a weapon, it was a presence. It bent around corners, defied walls, and shattered the belief that the mountain would shelter them. Long after the war ended, Former defenders described the tunnels as places where the air itself had turned against them. Historians who examined the battle in the decades that followed found themselves drawn into uncomfortable questions. The moral weight of using flame in confined spaces became a subject of debate, its legality recognized, its necessity defended, yet its consequences impossible to soften. Records showed that the weapon saved American lives in the thousands by dismantling positions that would have required days of fighting to clear. Yet those same records bore witness to the devastation it caused in the chambers below. Scholars wrote about strategy, efficiency, and doctrine, but between the lines, they acknowledged the deeper truth that warfare often demands choices no one wishes to make. In the analysis of the battle, tactical necessity collided with emotional consequence. Officers on the ground had ordered flame because no other method could breach the defenses without catastrophic loss. Infantry had advanced behind it because doing otherwise meant walking directly into machine gun fire. Tank crews had fired because their survival and the survival of the men behind them depended on it. In the cold logic of military calculation, the weapon was justified. But in the memories of those who used it, justification and understanding were separate things. The paradox remained: the flame tank saved lives even as it ended many others. Its efficiency shortened the battle, prevented further assaults, and dismantled positions that would have consumed entire companies. Yet it forced men to confront the destructive power they commanded, at distances close enough to feel the heat returning through the air. Modern readers often imagine war as a contest of clarity, right decisions, wrong decisions, clear lines. But those who had walked the volcanic sands knew better. War was a realm where choices were rarely clean, where survival sometimes required stepping into moral territory that left no ground untouched. As years passed and the conflict receded into history, the flame tank became something larger than a machine. It represented innovation, ingenuity, and the relentless drive to adapt under pressure. But it also became a symbol of tragedy, a reminder that every advance in capability carried a cost measured not only in lives, but in memory. The men who fought beside it understood this duality. They spoke of the weapon with respect, with hesitation, and with the quiet acknowledgement that some victories reshape the victors as deeply as the defeated. And in that dual legacy, the necessary and the sorrowful, the fire found its place in the story of a war where morality burned as fiercely as the weapon that came to define it. In the years that followed, military engineers from nations across the world pored over the records of the Pacific campaigns. What they found, again and again, was that the flamethrower tank had changed more than a single battlefield. It had reshaped the very logic of fortification. Hardened bunkers, once considered timeless pillars of defense, were now understood as vulnerable to a force that did not merely strike at stone, but flowed through it. Post-war design shifted accordingly. Nations experimented with deeper complexes, wider vents, and dispersed strongpoints, yet all bore the mark of a simple truth: armor had learned to carry fire. Defense ministries examined the photographs of burned embrasures and melted vents, recognizing that the tank's effectiveness had forced a broader rethinking of warfare's future. No matter how intricate or concealed, fixed positions could no longer guarantee survival against mechanized pressure. Even those that survived bombardment, even those shielded beneath yards of reinforced concrete, could be undone by a weapon that extended beyond line of sight. The lessons of the island spread quietly across continents, guiding the construction of bunkers from Europe to Asia. Fortification remained a discipline, but no longer a refuge. For veterans, the machines left a different legacy, one etched not into concrete or doctrine, but into memory. Those who served beside the flame tanks spoke of them with a blend of respect and unease. They acknowledged the protection the armor offered, the lives it saved, the positions it opened, but they also remembered the heat that returned through the air, the strange silence after a blast, the knowledge that the weapon's reach came at a moral cost. Their testimonies preserved both sides of the truth. The tanks were instruments of survival and instruments of devastation. Neither fact erased the other. On the opposite side of the conflict, Japanese officers who survived the war wrote candidly about the shock they felt when the tanks first appeared. They had prepared for artillery, for bombardment, for infantry assaults that spent themselves upon stone. But they had never imagined a machine that could project fire deeply enough to reach inner chambers, or with sufficient pressure to reshape the air within the tunnels. Their reflections, preserved in post-war analyses, read not as excuses but as recognition. They had built their fortress around an assumption, and technology had swept that assumption aside. In this way, the Pacific War became more than a clash of armies. It became a case study in how innovation erases certainty. It showed how quickly doctrines built over decades could falter when confronted by a single change in capability, and how strategy itself could be rewritten by machines forged in the urgency of battle. For military historians, the flame tank stood as both an emblem of adaptation and a reminder that warfare evolves not in steady lines, but in sudden, decisive shifts. Today the island lies quiet again. Wind moves over the black sand. Vegetation creeps along the shattered entrances of former tunnels. The earth holds no visible flame anymore, but the memory remains, embedded in reports, in testimonies, and in the stories carried home by those who endured the siege. Beneath its surface, fragments of glassed stone still mark the places where fire once swept through chambers carved for endurance. Time softens the landscape, but it does not erase the moment when innovation met belief, and belief gave way. The legacy of the flame tank is not measured only in its victories, nor solely in its destruction. It is measured in the way it forced two armies to confront the limits of what they thought possible, in the way it proved that no fortress is absolute, in the way it expanded the boundaries of both fear and strategy. They never believed fire could reach them. Then it arrived in armor,